Okay, today, lesson 1C, we continue with our theme of proportional relationships with ratios and percents. Today, we're going to work on how to find the percent of change. But that should be fairly simple because it really relies on some things that we've been talking about lately. So today, percent of change. So we've got some things we need to fill in our notes right below where you filled in your objectives. Percent of change is the ratio, which we've now seen that word ratio many, many times this year. But the percent of change is the ratio of the amount of change to the original amount. The ratio of the amount of change to the original amount. If a number increases from the original amount, it is called percent increase. Got some more things you need to fill in right there. And if a number decreases from the original amount, it is called percent decrease. Now I'm going to give you some examples of both of those, what we mean by increasing and decreasing. For some of you, I know I wouldn't have to give you examples, but I'm going to do that anyway. So underneath where you wrote in a percent of increase, let's write down this example here. If we're going from $30 to $37, that's an example of increase. And so we may be interested in finding the percent of that increase. And then below percent decrease, I'd like you to put this example. From 60 pencils to 24 pencils. We might be interested in figuring out the percent that the number of pencils decreased. And that's our focus today, figuring out what that percent of change actually is. Now what we're going to do is we're going to utilize the idea of continuing with this percent over 100 equals the part over the whole. But we're going to change the wording on it slightly to make it fit what we're doing today. So when we find that ratio of the amount of change to the original amount, we could utilize the proportional relationship n over 100 equals the amount of change over the original amount. And you have that in your notes. But that's really the same thing as percent over 100 equals the part over the whole. Now what I've written in blue there, I want you to add that to your notes. You actually have this percent over 100 equals the part over the whole. And the reason why I use the variable n over percent is because that's what we're trying to find in all of these percent of change problems. We're interested in finding what that percent is. To find the amount of change, which happens to be the part, some of you understand what those words mean, amount of change. How many did some situation change? If you don't get that, to figure out what that amount is, it's big number minus small number. And then the original amount, which happens to be the whole, that really is the first number. So what I've asked you to do here is, you have this proportion right here in your notes. Can you please add these parts in blue? And if you get stuck in recognizing what the part is, or the amount of change, it's the larger number minus the smaller number. If you're stuck finding the whole or understanding what original amount means, that's really the first number. Okay? So now we're going to put that to use. Yes? Not right now. No. Okay. So we have an example here from 5 to 7. And if we're interested in finding the percent that it changed when we went from 5 to 7, we would start by thinking about this proportion right here. N over 100 equals the amount of change over the original amount. So we'll start with this. N over 100, because we're finding the percent. Now the next question is, what is the amount of change? All right, so we have n over 100. The amount of change is 2. The original amount was 5. To solve this proportion, and to be perfectly honest with you, at this point in the school year, over the last month, we've probably solved 500 proportions. There should be no mystery as to how to solve this. We multiply both sides by 100. And the standard rule is that if you can reduce this original fraction you should. We can't in this one. So at this point, we multiply straight across. 2 times 100 is 200, and 5 times 1 is 5, and then we reduce or simplify that. 200 over 5 is 40. So when we're going from 5 to 7, that is a change of 40%. That's the percent of change, 40%. All right. I would like everybody to try number 1. To find the percent of change, one way is by setting up the proportion n over 100 equals the amount of change over the original amount. When we went from 10 to 15, the numbers changed by 5. From 10 to 15, that's a change of 5. And the original amount is the first amount, or the amount that it started with, which was 10. So here's our setup. If I'm solving this proportion, honestly, I reduce that 5 over 10 before I even start. It just makes the proportion a lot easier to solve. But here, because I know some of you leave it that way, I'm just going to go ahead and leave it that way. So we multiply both sides by 100. And we have 5 times 100 over 10 times 1. That's 500. Or excuse me, this should not be 200. This should be 500 right there. Over 10. Which is 50. And that is a 50% increase. All right, so that was a typo there with the 200 over 5. It should be 500 over 10. All right, let's go to number 2. Everybody try number 2. To find the percent of change, it is n over 100 equals the amount of change over the original amount. If we go from 12 to 9, that was a change of 3. And then the original amount is the number we started with, which was 12. And the setup should be easy at this point. I would reduce the 3 over 12 to 1 over 4 before I started. But if you left it alone, that's fine as well. But you're going to end up with 300 over 12. 3 times 100 is 300, and 12 times 1 is 12. And when you divide that out, you should end up with 25%. And that is a 25% decrease because we're going from 12 down to 9. The numbers decrease there. All right, let's go to the back side. I would like everybody to do number 3 and number 4, and then we will compare with our shoulder partner. Do 3 and 4, both of them, please. Number 3, we're going from 120 up to 210. That means that our numbers changed by 90. From 120 to 210, that's a change of 90. The original amount, the number that we started with, was 120. So the proportion that we should be using is this. n over 100 equals 90 over 120. Can you reduce 90 over 120, by the way? Yes. Yeah, what number obviously goes into the top and bottom? 33. Somebody said 3. Come on, there's 30. 30? Well, maybe I don't think 30 is obvious to everyone. There is a number that should be obvious, though. It's 10. You know, some of you were taught in the 6th grade, just chop off zeros. Well, that's not always good because sometimes some of you interpret that differently. If you divide top and bottom by 10, though, you are essentially chopping off the zeros if you want to think of it that way. But then that would leave us with 9 over 12 for that second ratio there, which is much, much easier to deal with. But regardless of what you did, and I keep leaving them like this in the notes simply because that's what still a lot of you are doing. And that division is much, much more difficult than what you would end up with if you had reduced. But we should end up with a 75%. And going from 120 up to 210, that is an increase. So 75% increase. Number 4. To go from 80 to 50. That is a change of 30. And the original amount was 80. So here's our setup. Question. Can 30 over 80 be reduced? Yes or no? Yes. Should be obvious. And once again, 10 will go under the top and bottom. That would be much, much easier to deal with than leaving it like that. But I'm going to leave it like that because that's what many of you do. And we end up with this. And that gives me a 37.5 or a 37.5% decrease. All right, let's go to number 5 now. Now we'll take it to a word problem, but it is exactly the same thing. Andrea's father went on a diet. When he started the diet, he weighed 250 pounds. At the conclusion of the diet, he weighed 175 pounds. Find the percent of change in his weight. Go ahead and give that a shot. So, we have n over 100, the amount of change. He weighed 250 pounds. He now weighs 175. That's a change of 75 pounds. The original amount is the amount of weight that he started at, which would be 250 pounds. And so this would be the setup. It should be fairly obvious to you that at least 5 goes into the numerator and denominator, but also 25. And look, if you divided top and bottom by 25, you would end up with a fraction, instead of being 75 over 250, as 3 over 10. And you have to admit, that's a lot easier proportion to solve than leaving it alone. But that's entirely up to you. I can only stand here and make that recommendation so many times. But regardless of how you attempted to solve it, it should be a 30% change in his weight. Okay, any questions about number 5? All right, and you did not have to write increase or decrease because it didn't ask us to. All right, let's try number 6, and then we'll compare with our shoulder partner. A bus driver usually makes 25 stops per day. Today she made 80 stops. Find the percent of change in the number of stops the driver made. All right, the bus driver usually makes 25 stops per day. That is considered to be the original amount. The amount of change, going from 25 to 80, that means it changed 55. So our setup would be something like this. N over 100 equals 55 over 25. I like the fact that a lot of you reduced that to 11 over 5 before you even started. That's a good strategy. But regardless of whether you reduced or not, you should end up with 220% change. Going from 25 to 80 is a change of 220%. All right, let's go to number 7. A house was purchased for $720,000. A year later, it is valued at $810,000. What was the percent of increase in value? You're finding the percent of change. 7. The house was purchased for $720,000. That is the original amount. Okay? Now, to go from $720,000 to $810,000, that means it changed $90,000. So the amount of change is $90,000, and the original amount is $720,000. There's a lot of reducing we can do with that $90,000 over $720,000. If you divided both top and bottom by 10,000, that would allow you to do this sort of thing. And look, you have a much, much easier proportion to deal with. You could even go further. 9 over 72 reduces down to 1 over 8. Now look, this proportion is much, much easier to deal with than that original thing that we had right there. So if you had not got to that point, can you go ahead and finish it right now, and then we'll check back in about 45 seconds. So to finish that off, we can multiply both sides by 100, and 100 divided by 8 is 12.5%. So to go from 720,000 to 810,000, that is a change of 12.5%. All right, let's finish this off with number 8. Everybody try number 8, and then we'll compare with our shoulder partner. Here's how we should end up with that. Our original amount for the bicycle was $120. It dropped in price to $90. So that means it changed $30. And once again, the original amount was $120. And for now, I believe the 8th time today, and probably about the 150th time over the last month, I would reduce that fraction that's there if I can. And 30 over 120, obviously you could at least divide top and bottom by 10, and then you should see that you could divide top and bottom by another 3 to reduce that to 1/4. But that's entirely up to you. That's a much easier proportion to deal with than the original one. But regardless, as Jermaine said, we should end up with a 25% change or a 25% discount in this problem. All right, we are finished for today.